Hello there and welcome back. It's good to see you. I'm glad that you're tuning in to our sermon series. Today we're going to conclude our look through our sermon series looking at the book of Esther. We're going to be looking at chapters 9 and 10 today. We've entitled this series God Behind the Scenes. We've had the privilege of looking at how even though God is not mentioned explicitly by name in the book of Esther, He is at work all over the place. Last week in chapters 7 and 8, we saw that God used unusual means to save His people. He actually reversed the tables on Haman, their enemy. Though Haman wanted to hang Mordecai, though Haman wanted to destroy all the Jews, it was actually Haman who was hung on his own stake, impaled on his own stake. The things that he had planned for the Jews came back on his own head, and great was his fall. Well, although the Jews see Haman defeated in chapter 7, and in chapter 8 we see Mordecai and Esther, they create this decree to kind of nullify the first decree. It allows the Jews throughout all the empire to gather and defend themselves against those who would seek their destruction on the 13th day of the 12th month as Haman had planned. Though that's written down, that day is still to come, as we're going to see in chapter 9. And there's still some loose strings that we need to tie up to kind of put a bow on the story. So this is where we find ourselves in chapter 9. The Jewish people are waiting for the 13th day of the 12th month just to see what exactly is going to happen. There's a lot of tension at this point that's still left unresolved. So we're going to see today that He's going to be faithful to His people. What He began, He's going to finish. What started with Haman is going to end in the defeat of all the Jews' enemies throughout the empire. And we're going to see that the Jews are going to commit themselves to remember what God has done for all of their years. Today I've entitled this sermon, Don't Forget to Remember. We're going to see the importance of remembering what God has done, how that can enrich our lives, it can change our hearts as we remember God's faithfulness. We remember what He's done, that He's with us now, and we remember His promises, what He's going to be faithful to do in the future. Before we jump in to the text in chapter 9, verse 1, let's go to the Lord in prayer. Dear Lord, I thank You for the opportunity to open Your Word, to have gone through Esther up to this point. It's a beautiful book. Thank You for opening our eyes to the beauty, just your deliverance, Your faithfulness to Your people. God, You're a promise-keeping God. And even when we can't see You or hear You or feel You're there because You promise never to leave us and never to forsake us. Lord, would You open our eyes to Your Word this morning? Open my mouth to speak as I ought to. And it's in Your name that I pray. Amen. So if you would look with me in chapter 9, verses 1 and 2, we'll jump into the story again. Verse 1 says, Now in the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, on the 13th day of the same, when the king's command and edict were about to be carried out, on the very day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain the mastery over them, the reverse occurred. The Jews gained mastery over those who hated them. The Jews gathered in their cities throughout the provinces of King Xerxes to lay hands on those who sought their harm, and no one could stand against them, for the fear of them had fallen on all peoples. Now, as we've seen the last couple weeks, from chapters 5 to 7, really, and 8, the story slows way down. I mean, in the first several chapters, the story takes place over many years. I mean, somewhere around 3 or 4 years pass just in the first couple chapters. But then when you hit chapter 5, things slow down. We see Esther's plea in front of the king and the first feast, and Haman going home and plotting against Mordecai and the king's sleepless night. All of these things just take place over the course of a couple days. But when we get to chapter 9, really between the end of chapter 8 and the beginning of chapter 9, 9 months have passed. That's important to keep in mind, right? That Mordecai has drafted this decree. We know that the Persian laws cannot be revoked. And so what he's trying to do is counterbalance Haman's decree. He's trying to provide a way for the Jewish people to survive, to be able to defend themselves. And yes, 9 months pass between the end of chapter 8 and the beginning of chapter 9. But the day that Haman had chosen as his lucky day that the Jews were going to be defeated, it's now come. And we're going to see, we're left wondering what's going to happen. And we see that the Jews gain the victory. It's interesting that it says on the very day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain the mastery over them, the reverse occurred, and the Jews gained mastery over those who hated them. It mentions enemies, like plural, and lots of them. There were those who hated them. And that may strike us as a little odd because up to this point, the one who was repeatedly called the enemy of the Jews is Haman. We're just really told of one man who's plotting against the Jews over and over and over again. And he's defeated. He's taken out of the picture. And yet there's still this group, the enemy of the Jews, those who hate the Jews and want to destroy them. One of the things I think we see throughout Scripture and really even obviously after the death of Christ and up until now, whether we're talking about Israel or we're talking about the church, we've always been a hated people, a persecuted people. Our enemies have never been hard to come by. And so these people have gathered to defeat the Jews, but we see that the tables are turned. Just like it was on Haman, it says, but the reverse occurred. The Jews defeated their enemies. And in verse 2, it seems to give us a hint as to why that has happened. Look at the end of verse 2. It says, no one could stand against them, for the fear of them had fallen on all peoples. We need to ask ourselves the question, why were the Jews victorious? Well, it wasn't because they were great at warfare or anything like that. It wasn't because they were a strong people. Remember, these are exiles. They are a weak minority in the Persian Empire. So it's not because of how great the Jews are or how strong the Jews are. See, Esther and Mordecai had done all that they could, and they were kind of left helpless as they stood back and watched what was going to happen. They had tried to nullify the first decree by issuing one of their own in the king's name. But here's the point. The Jews, Mordecai, Esther, though they had done all that they could, they still needed God to step in and save them. And He does precisely that in this chapter. It says at the end of verse 2 that the fear of them had fallen on their enemies. This is all God's doing. I mean, why should the peoples be so afraid of the Jews? It's because they were afraid of their God. They saw that clearly that something and someone powerful was behind the Jews. It was on the Jews' side, considering all these things that had happened and how the tables had been turned on Haman. Look at verse 3 and 4. It says, all the officials of the provinces and the satraps and the governors and the royal agents also helped the Jews, for the fear of Mordecai had fallen on them. For Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces, for the man Mordecai grew more and more powerful. You see, just as God has raised up Esther to be the king's queen, and we see how she's allowed to exert a lot of influence on the king, God has raised up Mordecai to take Haman's place, but he's really been elevated. He's greater than Haman ever was. In fact, it says all the officials, the officials, the satraps, the governors, the royal agents, that's another way of saying everybody in power. They were backing Mordecai. They were on the Jews' side. There's no other explanation for this than the fact that God is at work. And it's behind the scenes. The author, the narrator of Esther never says it explicitly. But we've got to read between the lines in Esther to see God is at work. These are not coincidences. None of these coincidences in Esther have been left up to chance or fate or luck. No, it's God's sovereign and providential hand at work on behalf of His people in the everyday happenings of life. So we see what happens in verse 5. It says, the Jews struck all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them. and they did as they pleased to those who hated them. In Susa, the citadel itself, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. And they also killed Parshandatha and Dalphon and Aspatha and Poratha and Adalia and Arishtatha and Parmashta and Arisai and Aradai and Vasitha, the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. But they laid no hand on the plunder. Now, I want to be clear here. It seems clear to me that the Jews are acting in self-defense. I think that's really important for us to remember. Mordecai's decree had allowed the Jews to gather for the purpose of defending themselves. This is not ethnic cleansing. This is not the Jews wiping out the people that they didn't like. No, the Jews are remaining within the confines of Mordecai's decree, and they are simply gathering for the purpose of self-defense. I think this is clear because in verse 5 it says, they killed their enemies. They struck all their enemies with the sword, and those who hated them. The people that the Jews are killing and have been attaining victory over, these are their enemies, the ones who have come against them to try to destroy them. But God has granted them victory. Those who had sought their harm, those who hated them, are falling before the Jews. I think this is clear as well because as we're going to see, there's going to be a lot of numbers mentioned here in the upcoming verses. But it's always men that are described as those among the casualties. It's always men. And we're going to see 3 times it says that the Jews did not lay hands on the plunder. This is not because the Jews were looking to increase their wealth or their standing as citizens in Persia. They were not trying to elevate themselves. They were trying to defend themselves. That's very important because I think chapter 9 and 10 are very misunderstood. I was just actually reading last night in preparation an opinion piece in the New York Times that was written in March of this year by a Jewish woman talking about how morally corrupt the book of Esther is and how it promotes things like ethnic cleansing and violence. And there's a lot of awful things in the book of Esther, but it is not a morally corrupt book. In fact, the Jews are acting only in a way to defend themselves. That's what's really going on here. We see that the Jews' enemies are ultimately fighting an impossible fight. The fear of the Jews and ultimately the fear of their God had fallen on all the people. All the people in power are backing the Jews. They're backing Mordecai. They're on the Jews' side. And so really the enemies of the Jews are left out in the cold. They're fighting a fight with no backing, no support. I want us to see that fighting against God and His people are only in one way, in defeat. And it mentions in verse 7 through 10, Haman's 10 sons. Apparently these were among those enemies of the Jews who had tried to come against them, perhaps to avenge their father, but they're listed along with the other 500 men who were killed. Look at me in verse 11 through 15. It says, that very day the number of those killed in Susa, the citadel, were reported to the king. And the king said to Queen Esther, in Susa, the citadel, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men, and also the 10 sons of Haman. What then have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is your wish? It shall be granted to you. And what further is your request? It shall be fulfilled. And Esther said, if it please the king, let the Jews who are in Susa be allowed tomorrow also to do according to this day's edict, and let the 10 sons of Haman be hanged on the gallows. So the king commanded this to be done, and a decree was issued in Susa, and the 10 sons of Haman were hanged. The Jews who were in Susa gathered also on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and they killed 300 men in Susa, but they laid no hands on the plunder. Now, this to me is one of the strangest parts of the book, and truthfully, it's a part of the book that I don't really understand, and it seems to me that a lot of Bible commentators also don't understand. We don't really know why King Xerxes gives Esther another opportunity to ask for something. I mean, he's just commented on how 500 of his citizens have been killed, and he remarks, there's no telling how many casualties there are throughout my empire. But then he goes on to ask Esther, what is your wish? What is your request? And honestly, I don't really know why he does that. Perhaps he's showing Esther that he's granting her additional favor. If there's anything else he can do for her, he asks what it is. Additionally, we don't really know why Esther asks for another day for the Jews to defend themselves. We don't really know whether her motives are good or bad. Whether she is trying to take things a step further than they should possibly go, or whether perhaps it's good intentions. Perhaps as queen she's heard about another group of people who are seeking to do the Jews harm, and she asks for another day for the Jews to defend themselves against their enemies. We're just given the facts. That's how the book of Esther is really presented to us often. We're just given the facts, not really told about people's motives often. But what we do know is that 300 of the Jews' enemies were foolish enough to attack on day 2. I mean, how stupid is that, right? Like, you've already seen 500 people defeated by the Jews, and yet you think the next day things are going to go better for you with 300? Doesn't seem to make sense, but we see 300 more of the Jews' enemies fall on the second day. Look with me in verse 16. It says, now the rest of the Jews who were in the king's provinces also gathered to defend their lives and got relief from their enemies and killed 75,000 of those who hated them, but they laid no hands on the plunder. This was on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th day they rested and made that day a day of feasting and gladness. But the Jews who were in Susa gathered on the 13th day and on the 14th and rested on the 15th day, making that day a day of feasting and gladness. Therefore, the Jews of the villages who live in the rural towns hold the 14th day of the month as a day for gladness and feasting, as a holiday, and as a day on which they send gifts of food to one another. What we see happen in verse 16 is the author really spans out, right? Kind of gives us a bird's eye view of what's going on throughout the empire. Up until this point, we've just been told of what's happening in the capital city, that 300 men had just died, and the day before that, 500 men were defeated by the Jews. Really, he pans out to see that this was going on throughout the whole Persian Empire, which was massive, stretched from Africa to India, largest empire the world had ever known. Well, on that day, 75,000 people had tried to kill the Jews, and the Jews had prevailed by God's grace. Jews throughout the empire had defeated their enemies. In terms of application, I think there's an important distinction we need to make between events like these that occur in the Old Testament and really its application, what it means for us as the church, as New Testament believers. One of the things that we see happen often in the Old Testament is warfare, right? Like the Jews go up against the Canaanites, the Amorites, all those ites, and God is telling them to clear them out of the land, out of the promised land. Or we see here in Esther the Jews defending themselves against their enemies and wiping out large numbers of people. We see these sort of things in the Old Testament, where God grants victory over the Jews' enemy, and they are really wiping people out to a large scale and to a large degree. That's one of the ways that God delivers His people in the Old Testament is by destroying their enemies. Yet here's where things have really begun to shift in our time in the New Testament, is God no longer really defeats or delivers His people by just destroying our enemies. That's not really what God is up to. You see, the beauty of the gospel, what God has done for us in Jesus, is that instead of wiping out His people's enemies, what He does is He actually creates a people for Himself out of His enemies. You see the difference? See, God sent His Son. Romans 5:10 says that He reconciled His enemies to Himself through the death of His only Son, Jesus Christ. See, we need to ask ourselves, who do we identify with in this story? Do we always identify ourselves with the good guys, right? Always David, never Goliath. Always the Jews, never the Persians. You see, if we understand our history, right, if we remember who we once were and what Scripture says that we were, Ephesians 2 says we were spiritually dead and not sons of God, not daughters of God. It says that we were enemies. We were his enemies. But yet while we were yet sinners, while we were yet his enemies, he sent his only son to die for us. So we need to ask ourselves, do we recognize that was once us, right? We were those who deserved to be wiped out, who deserved judgment, who deserved death. But instead of giving us what we rightfully deserved, instead he gave us his son as a free gift. Marvel at the grace in that he shows us by his son and his spirit. So in seeing that, what is our heart towards those who do not yet know him? Those who do not yet know God. We need to see that unlike Old Testament times, in a lot of ways, lost people, unbelievers, they're not our enemies. We're not allowed, we're not permitted to hate them. Right? I mean, there's some passages in the Old Testament that would seem to indicate that. The ending of Psalm 139, it's a beautiful psalm about God's knowledge of us, his protection of us. But there's an ending of that psalm that a lot of people don't quote from, where after David talks about his relationship with God, that's on such a deep level, he ends the psalm by saying, Lord, do I not hate those who hate you? Do I not loathe those who rise up against you? He says, your enemies take your name in vain and hold you in contempt. He said, I hate them with a complete hatred. I count them as my enemies. Oh, that you would slay the wicked, O God. And he goes on and on about how he longs for God to bring justice against his enemies. We need to see that was situated at a specific time for Israel and their relationship with God in salvation history. We're not permitted that attitude against unbelievers. Ephesians 6:13, Paul says, 6:12, Paul says, we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the cosmic powers, over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. I think so many times Christians get that wrong, and we end up hating certain groups of people, counting them as our enemies. But you see, as those who have been saved by the power of Jesus and the gospel, it changes the way we view others, those who do not yet know God. Our enemy is Satan and the cosmic powers of darkness who are blinding the minds of unbelievers. Our desire should be that they be saved. I think that we should make that clear. That it's not our job to hate those who are outside of the family of God, but to love them and to share this gospel of how they can come to find that acceptance and love that we've found by God's grace. What we see in these verses as well is the Jews start to just spontaneously and immediately feast and celebrate. The Jews who were in the capital city, they fought on the 13th and the 14th, so they did this on the 15th. Those who were in the villages and the rural towns and the rural places, they fought on the 13th and they rested on the 14th. They start to feast and celebrate what God had done for them in delivering their lives from their enemies. And the chapter really shifts at verse 20. Look with me. It says, and Mordecai recorded these things and sent letters to all the Jews who were in all the provinces of King Xerxes, both near and far, obliging them to keep the 14th day of the month Adar and also the 15th day of the same, year by year, as the days on which the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month that had been turned for them from sorrow into gladness and from mourning into a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and gladness, days for sending gifts of food to one another and gifts to the poor. So the Jews accepted what they had started to do and what Mordecai had written to them. You see how the Jews begin to celebrate, and Mordecai really commends them and regulates it. He writes down all the things that had happened to them, their whole story, and he sends it in a letter telling them to keep these days throughout all their years. as days of feasting and gladness and gifts to each other and to the poor. And what I love is what we see with Israel, with the Jewish people, is that their joy of salvation and their deliverance that God had brought, it's not merely individualistic, right? Like, I think we're far too often too individualistic as the people of God. Right? We worry about our quiet time and the things that we've got to do with the Lord and our individual relationship with God, and we neglect the joy that's meant to be shared in community with one another. This was about their community, not just them as individuals. God had saved them as a people, not just as individuals. And their joy was expressed in feasting, and they sent each other gifts, and they gave gifts and cared for the poor. Ask yourself, we need to ask ourselves, how does what God has done for us affect the way we treat others? Does it bind you to other believers? Do you see that we have this common salvation in common together? We share in this together. We're the body of Christ. May our joy be complete as we love and care for one another and remember what God has done. Verse 24. It says, "For Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them, and he had cast that is, cast lots, to crush and destroy them. But when it came before the king, he gave orders in writing that his evil plan that he had devised against the Jews should return on his own head, and that he and his sons should be hanged on the gallows. Therefore they called these days Purim, after the term pur. Therefore, because of all that was written in this letter, and of what they had faced in this matter, and of what had happened to them, the Jews obligated themselves that they would keep these days according to what was written, and at that time appointed each and every year." Do you remember the pur? Way back in chapter 3, verse 7, when Haman decided he was going to draft this decree of death and destruction, he was rolling the dice, right? Rolling the lots. They were called pur, to see what day his gods would grant him favor, right? To put his enemies to death, the Jews. But in even more irony, as we see all throughout the book, just as Haman had rolled pur for the Jews' destruction, after the Jews had found deliverance from him and all their enemies, they named their feast that they committed together to keep for all their years. They named it. They named their celebration Purim. It's amazing. It would remind the Jews throughout all their years, all their generations, that God is sovereign and in control. It would remind them of what Haman had done against them and how God had delivered them as a people from death. Pick up at the end of verse 26. It says, "Because of all that was written in this letter and of what they had faced in this matter and of all that had happened to them, the Jews firmly obligated themselves. The Jews obligated themselves and their offspring and all who joined them, that without fail they would keep these 2 days, according to what was written and at the time appointed every year, and that these days would be remembered and kept throughout every generation, in every clan, province, and city, and that these days of Purim should never fall into disuse among the Jews, nor should the commemoration of these days cease among their descendants." So we see the Jews, they add Purim as one of their holidays, their customs, in order to remember what God has done. One of the things that we see throughout the Old Testament is God repeatedly, over and over again, telling his people to remember what God has done. He told parents to teach their children as they went to bed at night, as they got up in the morning, as they went along the way, as they sat down and as they rose up, to always be teaching about God and what he had done to their children and to their grandchildren and to their great-grandchildren. Not only that, but God commanded them to keep certain days, certain holidays and customs, ordinances to remember what God had done. Passover was one of these. In Deuteronomy 16, God tells Israel, "You shall offer the Passover sacrifice, that all the days of your life you may remember the day when you came out of the land of Egypt. You shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and you shall be careful to observe these statutes. See, God wanted them to keep the Passover year after year so that they could remember who they once were, that they were slaves. They remember what God had done for them. For unless it's remembered and unless it's passed down, it would fall out of memory for the Jewish people. They would eventually forget, as we see that happens to the Jews. So many times they forget what their God had done for them, and they chase after other gods. God wanted them to remember all the days of their life. It wasn't just to be on Passover, that they remember all their days, that they had been brought out of slavery in Egypt. God does this with various feasts, the Feast of First Fruits, the Feast of Weeks, Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, the Feast of Booths. All these things were to help Israel remember their God and what He had done for them and to put Him first. I think that there's a multi-layered purpose in remembering. See, remembering is not just about looking back to the past and remembering what God has done for us. Actually, memory and remembrance changes the way we live now, and it reminds us of what lays ahead in the future. Through remembrance, it causes us to look back on what God has done, and it helps us in the here and now because it shows us that God has never left us, that He's still here with us today. And if He's always been with us and if He's here now, He's a promise-keeping God who will fulfill the things that He's promised us. He'll be with us in the future. Memory is multi-layered, and it affects our past, our present, and our future. Look at verse 29. It says, Then Queen Esther, the daughter of Abigail, and Mordecai the Jew gave full written authority confirming this second letter about Purim. And letters were sent to all the Jews to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Xerxes, in the words of peace and truth, that these days of Purim should be observed at their appointed seasons, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther obligated them, and as they had obligated themselves and their offspring with regard to their fasts and their lamenting. The command of Queen Esther confirmed these practices of Purim, and it was recorded in writing. Now, chapter 7, I don't know if you caught it or not, it appears to be a little redundant, right? Like we're told in verse 18 and 19 that the Jews, they were already beginning to celebrate and to have a feast and a holiday. And so Mordecai writes them and he tells them, yes, you've done good in doing this. Let's covenant and commit ourselves to remember this throughout all our days. And he kind of regulated what that should look like and the things that they should do. And then in verse 29 through 32, as we just read, Esther writes to the Jews and has it sent out to all of the empire, confirming these things that Mordecai had said and that they should observe Purim all the days of their life. We see repetition, redundancy. And I think the reason why it's told to them 3 times, and the reason we hear about the Jews' insistence on remembering what God had done 3 times, is it's like the author is saying, don't miss it. Right? It's a flashing neon sign. Don't miss this. The Jews committed themselves to remember what God had done. It's important for them, and I want us to see it's important for us as well. It's important for us as well. One of the things I think can help us with this is the church calendar, right? We think about a season of Advent and Christmas and Good Friday, Holy Saturday, Easter Sunday, Lent and Pentecost, Ascension, all of these things. They're seasons of the church's liturgical life that can help us to remember what God has done. I want to tell you that I'm happily a Baptist. Convictionally, I'm a Baptist, but this is one of the areas where I think that we as Baptists can really get stronger in. To maybe begin to consider to reflect on and to remember more of what God has done for us by observing more things in the church calendar. Probably for many of you who are listening, you recognize Christmas and Easter and maybe Good Friday, but some of the other things I said perhaps you've never heard of. I think maybe we can begin as a church to consider some of these things, how we might kind of tell where we are in the year and remember things throughout the year based on a church calendar. instead of things like sports, right? I think for so many of us, we kind of know where we are throughout the year based on what sports are occurring. If football's on, we're in the fall, right? If baseball's on, it's a different time of year. I think there's better ways that we can kind of navigate our lives and as the seasons change to remember certain things that God has done for us in our history. Notice in verse 31, it says, Queen Esther obligated them as they had obligated themselves and their offspring with regard to their fast and their lamenting. I don't know if you caught that, but that seems really out of place, right? I mean, we're hearing about the Jews' festivities and their feasts and celebrations and their gifts to the poor and to one another. And in the middle of that, we hear about fasts and lamenting. Well, what Esther does is she really starts a tradition of the day leading up to Purim, the day before, that they fast and they lament. Why do they do that? Well, I think remembering the pain and the terror also helps us to see deliverance in a different way. Right? In fasting the day before, the Jews are committing themselves to remember just how bleak their situation was. Just how hopeless their situation was without God. Remembering how dark those days were. And in doing that, when Purim came, it makes the rejoicing so much more sweet as they remember their deliverance. I think Good Friday, it helps us with this, right? Like we remember Good Friday, the Friday before Easter, the day that Jesus was crucified. And in our Good Friday services, it's often a very somber thing, right? It's a very serious thing. But it's so important to observe it because when Easter comes, it's all the more sweet. Jesus has defeated death, triumphed over it, and He's risen from the dead. We don't worship a dead Savior, but one who reigns on the throne. These things help us to do this, right? I've talked about some of these rituals and observances, but what I want us to see is it's not really about the ritual. It's about remembering. Notice that the Jews were already celebrating before Mordecai wrote to them and certainly before Esther wrote to them. Mordecai and Esther didn't have to tell the Jews, hey, this is something that we ought to remember. Right? The Jews in the countryside and in the city, they were already doing this. It was immediate. It was spontaneous. That's what joy of salvation looks like. Mordecai was not commanding this from them. He was simply regulating it. He was saying, this is good. Now this is what it should look like for us. I think about so many nominal Christians, right, who just show up one or two times a year, right? I often noticed going to church growing up that the pews were, the seats were a lot more filled and church had a lot more people in it on Christmas and on Easter. And I often wonder where all those people went on the other times of the year. See, if you only come when it's culturally expected of you, if you're only remembering God during those times, then God doesn't really interest you. You see, the purpose of Passover, the purpose of Christmas, Easter, whatever it was for Israel, whatever it is for us and our practices, the things that we observe to remember God. It's not just about those. Yes, we remember God's resurrection on Easter. We remember Christ coming into the world during a season of Advent and Christmas. But the reason we remember those is not so that it will just stay there, right? But that it will impact our whole lives. God had told Israel, remember the Passover so that all the days of your life, you'll remember that I brought you out of Egypt. This is the reason we celebrate and observe. It's not cultural. It should change our lives. We see the importance of remembering for us. You see, we, like Israel, are a forgetful people. We are. It's part of our human sinful nature. We're so prone to forget. We're so prone to wander away from God. See Israel hard-hearted so many times. God intervenes for them. He saves them. He delivers them. And then they go astray again. We're the same way. But God has given us graces to tether us to Himself so that we will not forget. He's given us His Spirit. He's given us His Word. These things tether us to reality so that we don't forget. We need one another. This is a grace that God has given us, that we as the body would come together and exhort one another to remember what God has done. It's one of the reasons we gather as Christians, to worship, yes, and to remember who God is and who we were and what He's done for us. Hebrews 3:13 says, exhort one another every day, as long as it is called today. Why? So that none of you may be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. If your sinful nature and my sinful nature are left unchecked by regular time with God, gathering together weekly, doing life with one another so that we can speak truth into one another's lives, if we are not taking advantage of those graces that God has given us, we will be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. We will forget what God has done and will wander away like a lost sheep. We need to remember. It's not something that we should just want to do. It's something that we need to do, to worship and remember. Look with me at chapter 10. It's just 3 verses. Kind of strikes us as a strange conclusion to the book. Look with me, chapter 10, verse 1. It says, King Xerxes imposed a tax on the land and on the coastlands of the sea. And all the acts of his power and might and the full account of the high honor of Mordecai, to which the king advanced him, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? Last verse, for Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Xerxes, and he was great among the Jews and popular with the multitude of his brothers, for he sought the welfare of his people and spoke peace to all his people. It's kind of a strange conclusion to the book of Esther, right? Like chapter 8 and 9, you see their final deliverance, their defeat of their enemies. We see them committing themselves together to remember. And chapter 10 just seems really out of place, right? Well, the king imposed a tax on all his lands. It was written down, and Mordecai reigned as number 2, and he sought the welfare of his people and of all the Persians. That's really how we end the book of Esther. See, the book doesn't just end with deliverance. Life goes back to normal. And I love that the book ends this way. It talks about taxation and record keeping and Mordecai prospering as second in command, and then the book just ends. We see here that there's a life beyond deliverance. What are we going to do with it? The Jews are delivered. They have their feasts and they remember and they commit to do this for as long as they are a people. They still do this today. And after that, things go back to the way they were in Persia. The king is still a wicked king, still imposing heavy taxes on the people. There was more to life after their deliverance, and it's the same with us. If you're a Christian and you're watching this, God has saved you. He's placed His Spirit in you. We often have these high mountaintop experiences with God, but at some point we have to come back down from the mountain and face everyday life, the reality of it. What are we going to do with it? How are we going to honor our God? How are we now to live? I believe that this text is saying, God is saying to us today, He's encouraging us, wanting us to remember what He's done, to remember who He is, and let that drive our lives, the way we live in the here and now. I want to close with some final application points. Number 1, ask yourself, whose side are you on? At the end of Esther, it's very clear. You're either a Jew on the Jews' side or you're an enemy. You're either on God's side or you're not. You're either His child or you're not. Don't play games with God. Hebrews 4:13 says, no creature is hidden from His sight. All are naked and exposed to the eyes of Him to whom we must give an account. God sees right through us. He knows us better than we know ourselves. If you're watching this and you've just kind of been playing games with God and going through the motions, stop it. Consider whose side you're on. Just because you practice the traditions and you're a part of this Christian culture does not mean that your heart has changed. If you've not repented and believed in Jesus, you're under the wrath of God. But the gospel is He can do something about that. Just turn to Him. Give Him your all. Number 2, we see that God will always preserve His people. No matter what the Jews went through, whether it be slavery in Egypt, exiled in Babylon, taken over into Persia, threatened by extinction and annihilation, God is always faithful to His people. He preserved a remnant for Himself by which He would bring Jesus into the world. He's created a church for Himself, and He remains faithful to us. He's a promise-keeping God. So no matter how bleak our times look like in the here and now, remember, He will preserve you. He will never abandon you. He will never leave you or forsake you. He will preserve you. Number 3, let's be faithful to remember what God has done. Consider ways that you can lead your family. Ways that you as a family unit can cause your children and your grandchildren to remember who God is, what He's done. This is a fitting conclusion. It's a major point of the book. See, it's not just about what God had done, right? If Esther ended at chapter 8, it would just be a record of everything that happened. But 9 and 10 wrap it up so perfectly because it ends with a commitment to remember it. That Purim would be remembered by the Jews for thousands of years after this and is still practiced today. What God has done for us in His Son Jesus should cause us to remember and rejoice. It should change how we live in the here and now. It should cause us to rejoice knowing that He's been faithful in the past, He's with us now, and He'll be faithful in the future. Let's pray. Dear Lord, I thank You for the opportunity to go through the book of Esther, Lord, to see your hand that's at work behind the scenes, to see that You are always faithful. You will always preserve Your people. Thank You for that, God. I pray that You would show us ways that we can remember what You've done in our day-to-day lives and in our life as a church, God, that You would cause us to remember who You are. In Your name that we pray. Amen.